Sometimes the people treated like they don't belong are the very ones holding the system together. The rain came down in slow silver streaks across downtown Baltimore, turning the courthouse steps into a mirror of blurred lights and restless shadows. People hurried through the cold evening with their heads down and collars pulled tight, desperate to escape the storm that rolled over the city like a warning no one wanted to hear. But inside courtroom 4B, the air felt heavier than the weather outside. It was the kind of silence that carried tension beneath it, the kind that made every cough sound louder and every glance feel dangerous. Officer Daniel Mercer leaned back in his chair near the defense table, his polished badge reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights above him. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the confidence of a man who had worn authority for too long, he watched the courtroom with the lazy smirk of someone convinced the world would always stay tilted in his favor. For 16 years, Mercer had built a reputation inside the Baltimore Police Department as the officer who never backed down. At least that was the official story. The unofficial version traveled quietly through whispered conversations in hallways and late-night diner booths. Stories about rough arrests, missing evidence, complaints that disappeared before investigations ever began. But none of it ever touched him. Men like Daniel Mercer rarely faced consequences. Across the room, seated quietly near the witness stand, was Vanessa Reed. She wore a charcoal gray coat still damp from the rain and held a leather folder tightly against her lap. Her natural curls framed a calm face that revealed almost nothing, but her eyes moved carefully across the courtroom, studying every detail with quiet precision. To most people watching, she looked like another exhausted black woman trapped in a system designed to ignore her. And that was exactly what Mercer saw when he noticed her. His eyes narrowed slightly before he muttered under his breath loud enough for nearby officers to hear, "They'll let anybody walk in here these days." A couple of officers chuckled softly. One looked away awkwardly, pretending not to hear. Vanessa remained still. She didn't react. She simply adjusted the folder in her hands and kept her gaze forward. That calmness irritated Mercer more than anger ever could. He stood up slowly and walked toward her, the sound of his boots echoing sharply against the courtroom floor. "Ma'am," he said, though there was no respect in his voice, "family seating is in the back. Witnesses don't sit up here unless they're called." Vanessa looked up at him without fear. "I'm aware of where I'm sitting, officer." Her voice was steady, controlled, almost cold. Mercer smiled, but it wasn't kindness. It was the smile of a man testing boundaries because he believed nobody would stop him. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you." The room grew quieter. Somewhere near the clerk's desk, papers stopped moving. Even the judge's assistant glanced up nervously before quickly looking away again. Vanessa slowly rose to her feet, standing eye level with Mercer despite the tension pressing against the room like invisible weight. For a second, neither of them spoke. Rain tapped softly against the courthouse windows while thunder rumbled somewhere far across the city skyline. Mercer folded his arms. "You got identification?" Vanessa studied him carefully, almost like she was memorizing his face. "Yes," she answered calmly. "I do." "Then show it." His tone hardened. "Or I can have security escort you out." A long silence followed. The kind that stretches just enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Vanessa glanced briefly toward the courtroom doors where two federal officers stood partially hidden near the entrance, their expressions unreadable. Then she looked back at Mercer. "Officer," she said quietly, "are you absolutely sure you want to do this in front of everyone?" Mercer laughed under his breath, shaking his head with arrogant disbelief. "Lady, you have no idea who you're talking to." But what Daniel Mercer didn't realize in that moment was that nearly every word leaving his mouth was already being recorded, documented, and transmitted into an active federal corruption investigation that had spent 8 months building quietly around him. And the woman standing in front of him was not a witness. She wasn't a defendant. She wasn't lost, confused, or powerless. Vanessa Reed was the senior federal investigator assigned to dismantle one of the largest police corruption networks in Maryland history. And tonight, Officer Daniel Mercer had just handed her exactly what she needed. The sound of thunder rolled across Baltimore as the courtroom doors slowly closed behind the last group of spectators entering for the evening hearing. Nobody inside realized the storm outside was nothing compared to the one building quietly within those walls. Officer Daniel Mercer stood near the center aisle with his jaw tight and his arms crossed over his chest, still watching Vanessa Reed with the same suspicion that had followed her from the moment she walked into the room. To him, she was another outsider challenging a system he believed belonged to men like him. But Vanessa had spent most of her life learning how to survive rooms exactly like this one. Rooms where silence protected power. Rooms where people looked away instead of speaking up. She could feel the eyes on her from every direction as she slowly reached into her coat pocket and removed a small black identification wallet. The movement alone shifted the atmosphere. One of the younger deputies near the courtroom entrance straightened slightly, his expression uncertain. Mercer noticed it too. "Go ahead," he said with a mocking grin. "This should be interesting." Vanessa opened the wallet carefully but did not hand it over. Instead, she held it just long enough for him to see the gold federal seal beneath the courtroom lights. The smirk on Mercer's face faded for only half a second before pride forced it back into place. "Federal investigator," he muttered, his tone suddenly less certain. Vanessa closed the wallet calmly. "Senior investigator with the Department of Justice." The words landed heavily in the room. Somewhere behind the jury box, someone inhaled sharply. Even the court reporter paused her typing for a brief moment before continuing again. But Mercer refused to step back. Men like him rarely admitted fear when witnesses were watching. "You expect me to believe that?" he asked. "You walk in here dressed like that, sitting wherever you want, and suddenly I am supposed to salute?" Vanessa looked directly at him, her expression unreadable. "No," she answered softly. "I expected professionalism." The silence after those words felt endless. Rain hammered harder against the courthouse windows while fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting pale reflections across the polished floors. Judge Harold Whitmore finally entered through the side chamber, adjusting his robe as he approached the bench. His tired eyes scanned the room until they landed on Mercer and Vanessa standing face to face near the witness stand. Irritation crossed his expression immediately. "What is going on here?" he demanded. Mercer turned quickly toward the judge. "Minor disruption, Your Honor. I was just verifying identification." Vanessa remained composed. "Your Honor, I believe Officer Mercer's conduct should become part of the official record." The courtroom became still again. Whitmore's face tightened almost imperceptibly. He recognized Vanessa Reed immediately, though he clearly had not expected her arrival tonight. "Miss Reed," he said cautiously, "I was informed your office would observe proceedings quietly." "That was the original plan," Vanessa replied. "Until your officer decided to create a public scene." Mercer shifted uncomfortably for the first time all evening. The confidence that once filled his posture now carried visible cracks beneath the surface. He glanced toward the other officers near the wall, silently searching for support, but none of them moved. None of them spoke. Because deep down, every person in that courtroom understood something important had just changed. Vanessa slowly placed her leather folder onto the nearest table. The sound alone echoed through the room with strange finality. "Inside this folder," she said evenly, "are 6 months of documented evidence connected to misconduct, witness intimidation, tampering of police reports, and coordinated obstruction involving members of the Baltimore Police Department." Mercer's face drained of color little by little. "You are bluffing." Vanessa did not blink. "A.M. For the first time that night, Daniel Mercer felt something unfamiliar creeping into his chest. Not anger. Not arrogance. Fear. Because the woman he had mocked only minutes earlier was no longer standing there as someone asking for respect. She was standing there holding the power to destroy everything he had spent 16 years protecting. The courtroom no longer sounded the same after Vanessa Reed placed that folder on the table. Before, there had been whispers, quiet shuffling, the careless confidence of people certain they controlled the room. Now every sound felt restrained, cautious, like the entire building itself understood something dangerous had entered the air. Judge Harold Whitmore adjusted his glasses slowly, buying himself time while his eyes remained fixed on the thick federal seal stamped across the front of Vanessa's folder. He had spent 23 years on the bench mastering one skill above all others, keeping his emotions hidden. But tonight, even he struggled to mask the tension creeping across his face. Daniel Mercer noticed it immediately. And that frightened him more than Vanessa ever could. Because men like Mercer trusted one thing more than the law itself. They trusted the protection of powerful friends. But for the first time, Judge Whitmore did not look protective. He looked nervous. Vanessa stood calmly near the witness stand while rainwater dripped softly from the edge of her coat onto the courtroom floor. Her posture remained composed, but inside her mind every detail was moving carefully into place. 8 months of undercover work. Dozens of interviews. Hidden financial records. Surveillance logs. Internal police communications that should have never existed. She had spent night after night inside cramped offices beneath fluorescent lights collecting fragments of corruption powerful people believed would stay buried forever. And now those fragments sat inches away from Daniel Mercer. This hearing is about police misconduct allegations involving Officer Raymond Pike, Vanessa said evenly, breaking the silence. But the evidence expanded beyond a single officer weeks ago. Mercer's jaw tightened. You cannot walk in here and accuse people without proof. Vanessa turned toward him slowly. Proof is exactly why I am here. The younger deputy near the courtroom doors shifted uncomfortably again. His name was Ethan Cole, barely 26 years old and only 2 years into the department. Until tonight, he had spent most of his career convincing himself the rumors about Mercer were exaggerated stories from bitter civilians. But now, watching fear spread across Mercer's face, Ethan began questioning everything he thought he knew. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat carefully. Miss Reed, perhaps this discussion should happen privately. Vanessa did not move. With respect, Your Honor, secrecy is the reason this situation exists in the first place. The words landed like cold steel. Several reporters seated near the back exchanged quick glances before scribbling notes onto yellow legal pads. One camera operator slowly adjusted his lens toward Mercer, capturing the sweat beginning to gather along the officer's forehead beneath the courtroom lights. Mercer noticed the cameras turning toward him and felt panic rise sharply inside his chest. Not because he believed he was guilty. Men like him rarely saw themselves that way. But because exposure terrified him more than consequences ever had. You think you are some kind of hero? Mercer snapped suddenly. You come in here pretending to save people while destroying careers? Vanessa studied him quietly before answering. Careers built on fear destroy themselves. The room fell silent again. Outside, police sirens echoed faintly through the wet Baltimore streets below while thunder rolled low across the harbor skyline. Mercer looked toward Judge Whitmore one last time, silently waiting for rescue, for reassurance, for the familiar protection he had always received. But the judge avoided eye contact completely. And in that small moment, Mercer finally understood something that shook him deeper than any accusation. He was standing alone. Vanessa slowly opened the folder at last. Inside were photographs, printed emails, banking transfers, witness statements, and disciplinary reports that had never reached public record. Ethan Cole caught a glimpse of one photograph and felt his stomach drop. It showed Mercer standing beside officers connected to cases that had quietly disappeared months earlier. Vanessa lifted one document carefully from the stack. Officer Daniel Mercer, she said calmly, do you recognize the name Marcus Hill? Mercer froze. The entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing with him. Because Marcus Hill was not just another name buried inside a report. Marcus Hill was the man whose case started the investigation that was now threatening to bring the entire department crashing down. The moment Vanessa Reed said the name Marcus Hill, the atmosphere inside courtroom 4B changed completely. It was no longer the tension of a routine hearing or the discomfort of public embarrassment. This was different. This felt personal. Officer Daniel Mercer stood motionless near the center aisle, but his breathing had changed. Slower. Heavier. Like a man trying desperately to regain control over something already slipping away. Across the courtroom, Judge Harold Whitmore lowered his eyes toward the bench for only a second, yet that single movement told Vanessa everything she needed to know. He recognized the name too. Vanessa carefully slid a photograph across the table toward the judge. Marcus Hill, she repeated calmly, 28 years old. High school basketball coach. No prior criminal history. Arrested 14 months ago during a traffic stop in West Baltimore. Ethan Cole swallowed hard as he listened. He remembered hearing whispers about that case inside the precinct. Officers said Marcus resisted instructions. Officers said there had been confusion. Officers said the body camera footage malfunctioned at the exact wrong moment. That explanation had always felt strange to Ethan, but questioning senior officers inside the department was not something rookies survived for long. Vanessa continued speaking, her voice steady enough to cut through the silence without ever rising. 3 witnesses gave statements saying Marcus Hill repeatedly asked why he was being detained. 1 witness reported hearing racial slurs before the arrest escalated. Mercer slammed his hand against the nearest table. That is a lie. Several people in the courtroom flinched at the sudden sound. Vanessa did not. She simply looked at him the same way she had since the beginning. Calm. Patient. Almost unsettlingly calm. The problem with lies, she said softly, is that eventually people stop protecting them. Mercer laughed bitterly, but the confidence behind it was gone now. You think one case is enough to destroy an entire department? Vanessa slowly reached into the folder again and removed another stack of documents nearly 2 inches thick. Marcus Hill was not one case. A low murmur spread through the room. Reporters leaned forward in their seats while the camera operator zoomed closer toward the evidence on the table. Outside, red and blue lights flashed faintly through the courthouse windows as rain continued pouring across the city streets below. Vanessa placed several photographs side by side. Different names. Different dates. Different neighborhoods. But every file carried the same pattern. Complaints dismissed. Evidence missing. Witnesses pressured into silence. And appearing in almost every report was the same name. Officer Daniel Mercer. Ethan Cole felt a knot forming in his stomach as realization settled deeper inside him. This was bigger than misconduct. Bigger than one officer with a bad temper. This was a system protecting itself for years while ordinary people paid the price. Judge Whitmore adjusted his robe nervously. Miss Reed, he said carefully, perhaps this material should be reviewed in chambers before becoming public record. Vanessa turned toward him slowly. With respect, Your Honor, some of these victims already spent years being ignored behind closed doors. The judge said nothing after that. Because there was nothing he could say without sounding guilty himself. Mercer looked around the courtroom desperately now, searching for support that no longer existed. Officers who once laughed beside him avoided eye contact entirely. Even the bailiff standing nearest the wall had stepped farther away. It was happening silently, but Mercer could feel it. The room was abandoning him piece by piece. Vanessa noticed it too. You know what surprised me most during this investigation? She asked quietly. Mercer stared at her with exhausted anger. What? Vanessa paused for only a second. How many good officers stayed silent because they were afraid of people like you? Those words struck harder than any accusation before them. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately because deep down he knew she was talking about officers exactly like him. Officers who saw warning signs but convinced themselves it was safer not to ask questions. Vanessa gathered the files neatly back into the folder before speaking one final time. Tonight is not about revenge, she said. It is about truth finally entering a room where fear controlled everything for too long. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Daniel Mercer realized the investigation had never truly been about exposing corruption. It was about exposing the silence that allowed it to survive. Rainwater streamed down the courthouse windows in restless waves while the city outside disappeared beneath flashing patrol lights and distant thunder. Inside courtroom 4B, nobody seemed comfortable breathing too loudly anymore. The room that once belonged to confident officers and untouchable authority now felt fragile, almost unstable, as if one more truth might crack the entire system open in front of everyone watching. Vanessa Reed remained standing beside the evidence table with quiet control, but exhaustion lingered beneath her calm expression. 8 months undercover had taught her many things about corruption, but the hardest lesson was how loneliness followed people who chose to speak the truth. She looked around the courtroom and saw it clearly in every face. Fear. Regret. Shame. And somewhere beneath all of it, something else beginning to surface. Doubt. Ethan Cole could barely keep his hands still. He stood near the courtroom doors replaying old memories in his mind with painful clarity. Complaints he had ignored. Civilians he assumed were exaggerating. Officers laughing in locker rooms after questionable arrests. At the time, staying silent felt easier than risking his career. But now silence felt heavier than guilt itself. Judge Harold Whitmore leaned back slowly in his chair, staring down at the stack of files Vanessa had revealed. His carefully controlled image was slipping little by little beneath the pressure tightening around the room. "This hearing is suspended until further review," he announced finally, though his voice lacked authority now. Vanessa looked toward him immediately. "With respect, Your Honor, delaying this process only gives people time to erase evidence." Whitmore's eyes hardened briefly. "Are you accusing officers of obstruction?" Vanessa answered without hesitation. "I am saying it has happened before." The words settled heavily across the courtroom. Daniel Mercer felt anger rising inside him again, but this time it came tangled with desperation. He stepped forward, pointing toward Vanessa with trembling frustration. "You walk in here acting like you know everything about this department." Vanessa met his stare evenly. "No. I spent months learning how much people suffered because nobody stopped it." Mercer shook his head bitterly. "You think these people care about you? The second this story fades, they move on. They always do." For the first time all evening, emotion flickered visibly across Vanessa's face. Not fear. Not rage. Something sadder than both. "Marcus Hill's mother still keeps his coaching whistle beside her kitchen window," she said quietly. "Every morning before work she touches it because it reminds her of who her son really was before the city reduced him to a police report." The courtroom became completely silent. Even the reporters stopped writing. Vanessa slowly looked around the room again before continuing. "You know what she told me during our first interview?" Mercer said nothing. Vanessa's voice softened almost to a whisper. "She said the hardest part was watching everyone act like her son's dignity was negotiable." Ethan lowered his eyes immediately, feeling shame settle deeper into his chest. Because suddenly this investigation no longer felt like politics or procedure. It felt human. Outside the courthouse, the storm intensified. Sirens echoed across wet streets while wind rattled against the old building windows. The city kept moving as if nothing inside this courtroom mattered. But inside these walls, lives were quietly changing forever. Vanessa carefully closed the folder in front of her. "People think corruption survives because powerful men protect each other," she said calmly. "But that is only half the truth." Mercer stared at her with exhausted silence. Vanessa continued. "It survives because good people convince themselves staying quiet is safer than doing what is right." Ethan felt those words strike directly through him. Because deep down he knew she was right. The room remained still for several long seconds until suddenly the courtroom doors opened behind him. Every head turned at once. 2 federal agents stepped inside wearing dark overcoats damp from the rain. One carried a sealed evidence case beneath his arm while the other scanned the room with sharp, unreadable eyes. The taller agent approached Vanessa quietly before handing her a folded document. She opened it slowly, reading only a few lines before lifting her gaze toward Judge Whitmore and Daniel Mercer. And for the first time that night, even Vanessa Reed looked shaken by what she had just learned. The rain outside had not stopped for hours, and by now the courthouse windows looked almost black beneath the storm clouds hanging over Baltimore Harbor. Inside courtroom 4B, Every person remained frozen in uneasy silence as Vanessa Reed stared down at the document the federal agent had just handed her. The paper trembled slightly between her fingers, not from fear, but from the realization that the investigation had suddenly become far more dangerous than anyone inside that room understood. Daniel Mercer noticed the change in her expression immediately. For the first time all night, Vanessa looked caught off guard. And that small crack in her composure gave Mercer something he had nearly lost completely. Hope. What is it? He asked sharply, trying to sound confident again. Vanessa did not answer right away. Her eyes moved slowly across the page once more before she finally looked toward the two federal agents standing near the doors. When did this happen? The taller agent spoke quietly enough that only part of his sentence carried across the room. Approximately 40 minutes ago. Internal Affairs secured the files before they disappeared. Judge Harold Whitmore straightened in his chair. What files? Vanessa folded the paper carefully before placing it beside the evidence folder. The room waited. Every reporter. Every deputy. Every nervous spectator sitting on those wooden benches beneath the cold fluorescent lights. Vanessa took a slow breath. Someone attempted to access sealed federal evidence connected to this investigation tonight. A murmur spread immediately through the courtroom. Mercer's face tightened again, though this time confusion mixed with his anxiety. You think I had something to do with that? Vanessa looked directly at him. I think someone inside the department realized this case was collapsing faster than expected. Ethan Cole felt his pulse quicken. He remembered seeing unusual activity earlier that evening near the records division. Officers whispering. Phones disappearing the moment supervisors entered rooms. At the time it felt strange. Now it felt terrifying. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat uneasily. Miss Reed, if federal evidence has been compromised, perhaps we should postpone these proceedings entirely. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. And give whoever panicked enough time to erase more? Whitmore said nothing. Because once again, she was right. The storm outside shook the courthouse windows with another low rumble of thunder while red emergency lights reflected faintly against the polished courtroom floor. Vanessa slowly walked toward the center aisle, her footsteps echoing softly through the silence. Do you know what corruption fears most? She asked quietly. Nobody answered. Her voice remained calm, almost reflective. Not exposure. Exposure comes later. Corruption fears panic. Because panic is when people stop protecting each other. Mercer stared at her, breathing harder now. He had spent years believing loyalty inside the department was permanent. But tonight he could feel that loyalty dissolving minute by minute. Officers were already distancing themselves. Supervisors were avoiding calls. And now someone inside the system was trying to destroy evidence before federal investigators could reach it. That meant one thing. The people above him were afraid too. Vanessa turned slowly toward Ethan near the courtroom doors. Deputy Cole. Ethan looked startled hearing his name. Yes, ma'am. You worked records intake during the Marcus Hill case, correct? Ethan hesitated. Mercer's eyes locked onto him instantly, sharp with warning. But for the first time since joining the department, Ethan no longer feared disappointing Mercer nearly as much as he feared disappointing himself. Yes, he answered quietly. Vanessa studied him carefully. Did you ever notice missing documentation connected to officer complaints? The courtroom became unbearably still. Ethan felt every eye turn toward him at once. His throat tightened. He thought about his father back home in Philadelphia, a retired firefighter who once told him that wearing a uniform only mattered if you deserved the trust that came with it. For years Ethan convinced himself staying silent was survival. But suddenly survival no longer felt honorable. Mercer took one step forward. Watch yourself, kid. Vanessa immediately stepped between them, calm but firm. No intimidation. Not anymore. Ethan swallowed hard before finally speaking. Yes, he admitted softly. Some reports disappeared before they reached review. The room erupted into stunned whispers. Mercer closed his eyes briefly, almost like a man realizing the floor beneath him had finally collapsed. Because the moment Ethan spoke those words out loud, silence stopped protecting the system. The silence after Ethan Cole's confession felt heavier than the storm pounding against the courthouse windows. Nobody inside courtroom 4B moved for several seconds. The air itself seemed frozen beneath the weight of what had just happened. Because once a good officer finally spoke the truth out loud, the illusion holding everything together began collapsing faster than anyone could control. Daniel Mercer stood near the center aisle with his face drained of color, staring at Ethan like he no longer recognized him. Betrayal burned across Mercer's expression, but beneath it was something far worse. Fear. The kind that comes when a man realizes his power depended entirely on people staying quiet. Vanessa Reed watched the room carefully. She had seen moments like this before during federal investigations. The exact second silence breaks is never loud. It happens quietly, almost invisibly, as fear changes sides. Judge Harold Whitmore removed his glasses slowly and rubbed his eyes with trembling fingers. The polished confidence he carried for decades was disappearing piece by piece beneath the fluorescent courtroom lights. Reporters near the back benches typed furiously now, their phones glowing as messages spread beyond the courthouse walls and into newsrooms across Baltimore. Outside, camera crews were already gathering beneath umbrellas in the rain. The story was escaping containment. Mercer pointed toward Ethan again, his voice strained with disbelief. "You think they are going to protect you now? You just destroyed your career." Ethan looked shaken, but for the first time all evening, he did not lower his eyes. "Maybe," he answered quietly. "But at least I can still look at myself in the mirror." Those words cut deeper than Mercer expected. Because somewhere beneath years of arrogance and unchecked authority, part of him understood the truth inside them. Vanessa slowly stepped closer to the evidence table again. "Deputy Cole is not the only officer who came forward," she revealed calmly. Mercer's eyes widened instantly. Vanessa opened another section of the folder and removed several signed affidavits. Over the last 3 months, 7 officers agreed to confidential interviews regarding misconduct, missing evidence, and intimidation tactics connected to internal investigations. The room erupted into whispers again. Mercer looked around desperately, trying to identify which officers betrayed him, but nobody met his gaze anymore. Some stared at the floor. Others looked toward the rain-covered windows. The loyalty he once commanded had dissolved completely. Vanessa continued carefully, her voice steady and controlled. Most of them stayed silent for years because they feared retaliation. Transfers. Suspensions. Public humiliation. Judge Whitmore looked toward her with visible concern. "And now?" Vanessa's expression hardened slightly. Now they realized silence was costing innocent people far more. Thunder shook the courthouse again as emergency lights flickered faintly across the ceiling overhead. Ethan noticed one elderly woman seated near the back wiping tears from her eyes quietly. He recognized her suddenly from the case files. Denise Hill. Marcus Hill's mother. She had entered unnoticed nearly 20 minutes earlier and remained silent ever since. Vanessa turned toward her respectfully. "Mrs. Hill," she said softly, "would you like to say anything before proceedings continue?" The courtroom held its breath. Denise Hill slowly stood from the wooden bench, clutching a folded photograph against her chest. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice carried remarkable dignity when she finally spoke. "My son believed this city could become better," she said quietly. Even after everything that happened to him, he still believed people could change. Mercer looked away immediately. Denise continued, tears shining in her eyes beneath the harsh courtroom lights. "I spent 14 months wondering if anybody inside this system remembered my son was human before he became paperwork." Several reporters lowered their cameras slightly. Even Judge Whitmore seemed unable to look directly at her. Vanessa remained silent, allowing the woman space to speak. "Tonight," Denise whispered, "for the first time since I lost him, I feel like somebody finally listened." The room became painfully still again. Ethan felt emotion tighten inside his chest while rain continued streaming down the courthouse glass behind them. Mercer stared toward the floor now, unable to escape the reality surrounding him. Because the investigation was no longer just about corruption, missing evidence, or abuse of power. It had become something much harder to fight against. Humanity. And deep down, Daniel Mercer finally understood something terrifying. Badges could silence fear for years. But they could never silence truth forever. By the time Denise Hill sat back down on the wooden bench, the entire courtroom felt emotionally exhausted. The storm outside continued raging across Baltimore, but inside courtroom 4B another kind of storm had already broken apart years of silence in less than one night. Nobody looked at Daniel Mercer the same way anymore. Not the reporters. Not the deputies. Not even the officers who once stood proudly beside him in department photographs hanging across precinct walls. He could feel it in every avoided glance and every uncomfortable silence surrounding him. The authority he wore for 16 years no longer protected him. It isolated him. Vanessa Reed remained near the evidence table, watching the room carefully while federal agents quietly coordinated near the courtroom entrance. Her posture remained composed, but fatigue pressed heavily behind her eyes now. Investigations like this never ended cleanly. Too many lives became tangled in the fallout. Careers. Families. Trust. Once corruption surfaced publicly, nobody escaped unchanged. Judge Harold Whitmore stared down at the bench in front of him as though searching for words that no longer existed. The old confidence in his voice had disappeared completely. "Miss Reed," he said quietly, "how far does this investigation actually reach?" Vanessa paused before answering. Farther than anyone inside this room wanted to believe. The judge closed his eyes briefly. Somewhere near the back benches, a reporter's phone vibrated repeatedly with incoming updates from outside. News stations had already begun broadcasting live coverage from the courthouse steps. The city was watching now. Mercer noticed it too. His breathing grew uneven as realization settled deeper into his chest. For years he survived complaints because nobody paid attention long enough to challenge the system protecting him. But this was different. This story had witnesses. Cameras. Federal oversight. And worst of all for Mercer, it had momentum. He suddenly looked toward Vanessa with something almost desperate beneath his anger. "You think exposing all this fixes anything?" he asked bitterly. "Tomorrow there will still be crime. Still fear. Still people blaming cops for everything wrong in the city." Vanessa listened without interrupting. "You have no idea what this job does to people," Mercer continued. "Every night walking into neighborhoods where nobody wants you there. Every traffic stop wondering if somebody is hiding a weapon. Every call turning dangerous in seconds." His voice cracked slightly beneath the pressure building inside him. "You stop trusting people after enough years." Vanessa looked at him quietly for several long seconds before speaking. "And when people stop trusting you back, what happens then?" Mercer said nothing. Because deep down, he already knew the answer. The silence between them stretched across the courtroom like a mirror, forcing everyone present to confront uncomfortable truths they spent years avoiding. Ethan Cole watched both of them carefully. For the first time all evening, he no longer saw Mercer simply as a villain. He saw something more complicated and more tragic. A man who allowed fear and unchecked power to slowly erase his humanity one decision at a time. Vanessa slowly stepped closer to Mercer, though her voice remained calm and controlled. "Being afraid is human," she said softly. "But deciding certain people deserve less dignity because of that fear is where corruption begins." Mercer lowered his eyes toward the floor. Rain continued tapping steadily against the courthouse windows while distant sirens echoed somewhere beyond the harbor streets below. The city sounded restless tonight. Uneasy. Like Baltimore itself understood change had already begun moving through its foundations. One of the federal agents approached Vanessa quietly and handed her another document. She reviewed it quickly before looking toward Judge Whitmore. "Internal Affairs has officially suspended 3 additional officers connected to the investigation." Another wave of whispers spread through the room. Mercer leaned back against the defense table as though his strength had suddenly abandoned him. The system protecting him was collapsing faster by the minute. Vanessa carefully closed the folder again and looked across the courtroom one final time. For years, she said calmly, people inside this city were told their voices did not matter because they lacked power. She paused briefly. Tonight they learned something important. Every eye remained fixed on her. Vanessa's voice softened almost to a whisper. Truth becomes power the moment someone finally dares to speak it out loud. And in the silence that followed, nobody inside courtroom 4B could deny the truth anymore. The system had not started breaking tonight. It had already been broken for years. Tonight was simply the first time the lights were finally turned on. The rain finally began to slow sometime after midnight, leaving the streets of downtown Baltimore shining beneath red traffic lights and the reflection of television cameras parked outside the courthouse. Inside courtroom 4B, exhaustion hung over everyone like a heavy fog. Hours earlier, the room had been filled with arrogance, dismissal, and quiet fear. Now all that remained was silence and the uncomfortable weight of truth settling into places where denial once lived. Daniel Mercer sat alone near the defense table, no longer surrounded by officers eager to stand beside him. The isolation was impossible to ignore. Every few minutes reporters outside the courtroom doors shouted updates into microphones while camera flashes reflected against the hallway walls. The city knew his name now for reasons he never imagined. Vanessa Reed stood near the windows overlooking the rain-soaked courthouse steps below. Her reflection stared back at her through the glass, tired but steady. 8 months of investigations, interviews, threats, and sleepless nights had led to this moment. Yet victory did not feel triumphant the way people imagined. Exposing corruption never restored the years people lost. It only stopped more years from being taken. Ethan Cole approached quietly, still wearing his deputy uniform though it suddenly felt heavier than ever before. "Miss Reed," he said softly, "can I ask you something?" Vanessa turned toward him. "Of course." Ethan hesitated before speaking. "How did you keep going?" She studied him carefully. "What do you mean?" "After hearing all those stories. After seeing what people covered up." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. Most people would have walked away. Vanessa looked back toward the rain outside for a moment before answering. "Because every person in those files had someone who loved them." Ethan remained silent. Vanessa continued quietly. A mother waiting for a phone call. A child asking when their father was coming home. Families trying to understand why dignity suddenly became negotiable. Her voice softened further. Once you hear enough pain, walking away stops feeling possible. Across the courtroom, Judge Harold Whitmore slowly removed his robe and folded it carefully over the back of his chair. The gesture felt strangely symbolic, almost like a man quietly setting down the authority he once trusted too easily. He looked older tonight than when the hearing began. "Miss Reed," he called softly. Vanessa turned toward him. Whitmore hesitated before speaking again. "I spent years convincing myself protecting the institution meant protecting justice." He looked down at the bench beneath him. "I realize now those are not always the same thing." Vanessa nodded slightly but said nothing. Some realizations arrived too late for apologies to fully matter. Mercer suddenly stood from his chair, drawing everyone's attention once more. For a second the room tensed instinctively, but the anger that once defined him seemed drained away completely. He looked toward Vanessa with exhausted eyes. "You know the worst part?" he asked quietly. Vanessa waited. Mercer laughed bitterly under his breath. "At some point I stopped seeing people. I only saw threats. Complaints. Problems." The room remained silent as rain tapped softly against the courthouse glass behind them. Mercer looked toward Denise Hill sitting near the back bench clutching her son's photograph against her chest. Shame crossed his face visibly for the first time all night. "I told myself I was protecting the city," he whispered. Denise did not answer him. She simply held the photograph tighter in her hands. Vanessa stepped forward slowly. The badge was never supposed to make people feel smaller, she said calmly. It was supposed to make them feel safe. Mercer lowered his head. Outside the courtroom, federal agents moved through the hallway carrying sealed evidence boxes while reporters continued broadcasting live updates into the early morning. Darkness. Baltimore would wake up tomorrow to headlines, investigations, suspensions, and outrage. But somewhere beyond the politics and public statements, something quieter had happened tonight too. People who spent years feeling invisible were finally heard. Vanessa picked up the evidence folder one final time before walking toward the courtroom doors. Ethan watched her carefully as she passed. "Do you think things can actually change?" he asked. Vanessa paused beneath the fluorescent hallway lights without turning around. "Change does not begin when powerful people speak," she answered softly. "It begins the moment ordinary people stop being afraid of the truth." Then she walked into the hallway as cameras flashed outside the courthouse entrance and the first calm silence after the storm finally settled across the city.